Well, welcome back, everybody. We are back for part 2 of the 314 with a diesel swap. You guys saw in the last video, we got this thing stripped down, somewhat washed it, got it cleaned up, and I've done a little bit more work off camera, mostly because it's boring. I just pulled some more panels off and stripped a whole bunch of junk off this thing that we're not going to use anymore. So as far as what we're going to try to get done in this video, we're going to hopefully get the engine fully mounted, get the belt drive put on it, and make sure all that stuff's working right. Make sure the transmission's going to work like it should. Yeah, so it's kind of time consuming work. It's not difficult. If you guys are on the fence about doing this, it's not bad. I mean, it can't get any easier. These frame rails are nice and flat. It's not hard at all. But I'm going to go over how we're going to go about mounting this thing. So anytime you guys go to do an engine swap, whether it be a wheel horse or a lawn chief, any kind of tractor that's got belt drive, you need to be aware of where the shaft comes out of the engine at. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. You guys can see on this Kohler here, from the faceplate or the bottom plate to the center of the crank is right at, I think that's about a 6-inch. You go to the new engine, it's about 5 1/4. Now that's important because whenever you go to mount this thing, if you do not have it centered where it was and the engine and the crank in the same position, your belt is not going to be routed properly. Now I want to retain the factory belt guards. I want this tractor to be as factory as possible when it comes to those systems. So to do that, you usually got to build a custom riser plate. Now that may sound complicated, but it's really not. So if you look at my crude drawing here, you can see the old Kohler was 6 inches from the base to the center of the crank, and the new engine is 4 3/4. So that means we have got an 1 1/4 height difference that we have to make up. So what I'm going to do, I've got an 1/8-inch steel plate. I'm going to cut a rectangle out of that, and I've got some thick wall round tubing. I'm going to cut some spacers that are 1 1/8 tall. So by the time you add those two together, that should make up the 1 1/4 difference. So the crank will be in the same position as the old engine was. Now the other important thing to take into account is obviously making sure your engine is squared up to the frame, to the belt drive. We're going to go off the assumption that all that is parallel and squared up to the frame. So whenever we go to mount that engine, we want it to be square to the frame and in the same spot as the original one. Now these wheel horses make it a little bit easier because you've got the old bracket here for the old clutch. That is dead center to the crankshaft. So whenever we go to mount the new engine, we need to make sure it's the same height, it's square to the frame, and it's centered where the old one was, and our belt should mount right up and everything's fine. Now, since I'm only going to be using this tractor to push the snow plow, I'm not going to be putting the original clutch back on it. This thing will never have a mower deck on it. It'll never have any other attachment besides a snow blade and maybe a grader blade. So that being said, pretty simple. This is just your standard, I think this pulley fits 4L and 5L belts. If you guys can see that part number there. This is straight off Amazon's website. This is the same thing you can go to Tractor Supply and buy off the shelf. But there's a problem. The crank on these engines is 20 millimeter. Well, you know, not a problem, I guess, but most standard pulleys you're going to find here in the States is going to be 3/4 or 1 inch, whatever. This pulley happens to be 3/4, which, you know, if you guys are smarter than me, you know automatically. I had to Google it. 19 millimeter. So we're going to have to bore this one out to 20 mil to fit on the shaft. Do a little shaving on the keyway to make sure that works. And yeah, so before I go mocking the engine up in place, I need to get this bored out, get this put on the crank, so I've got a nice flat plane to go off of for lining the belts up. So enough rambling, let's get to work and get this pulley put on there. All right guys, this is what I'm gonna try. I've got the pulley put in my vise here, and all I've done is taken a long bolt, put a slit in it, and I've got a whole bunch of Scotch paper or Scotch-Brite, whatever you guys call it. It's like 50 grit or something. It's a pretty aggressive grit. So all I'm gonna do is just use the drill and bore this out. We only gotta take 1 millimeter off, and that might sound like a lot, but I don't think it's gonna be that bad. I've got plenty of time to do this and plenty of Scotch paper. So I did call a machine shop to get a quote on what he would charge to do this. And it was pretty insane. It was like $200 or something. So for $200, I could buy a whole lot of sandpaper for that. So we're gonna try this, and got my cheap calipers set up, so we'll get it close. And as soon as we get close to 20, we'll slide it on the crank and see what happens. So here we go. All right, guys, after probably, I don't know, 45 minutes of going at this with my sandpaper rig there, and I even broke out the old die grinder with the, what do you call that, a burr bit, just to kind of do a couple rough passes on it and then shined it up. But we got it pretty good now, sliding on like I want it to. I am gonna have to do some modifying to, or on a keyway. This has got some grub screws in it, but I've never really trusted those things to hold it in place on the crank. So I'll probably end up cutting a custom keyway to put in there. But for any of you guys thinking about doing this to this pulley, couple suggestions. You guys saw I'm using this skinnier like M8 bolt. What I would do, which I didn't have the ability to because my chuck is too small, get you a bigger bolt. That way you're using less Scotch-Brite to fill the gap to keep a tight fit. So the bigger the bolt you use for a chuck, the better results you're gonna have. Of course, the other option is to buy a 20 millimeter V-belt pulley. I didn't really spend a whole lot of time looking for one. I'm sure if I had, I could have found something that worked. This was cheap and easy, and I went that route. And of course, I'm sure there's a better way to do this. This is just what I came up with. So anyway, let's move on to the engine plate. So I mentioned you need to make sure you square it up. I told you guys about that hole in the frame so I can kind of eyeball the crankshaft. Now I got you guys set up. This is just rough. I'm just trying to figure out how big of an engine plate I need because I'm going to cut this one to size. I want to leave myself some leeway so I can adjust it if I need to. So I think that's going to work. I think I'll be able just to cut an engine plate pretty much the same size as the frame rails. And we'll leave it kind of long so we don't have to drill any new holes in the frame. So let's get that plate cleaned up and get it cut, and we'll move on from there. Well, guys, I tried the plasma cutter again, and it's still, I got to get that new outlet put in the garage. The cord that's on it doesn't match my air compressor, and I don't know. It's a handy tool. It's just anything more than sheet metal, it won't cut running 110. So, going the old-fashioned way, use the death wheel. We'll see if we can't get this cut. Alright guys, we got the plate cut. I'll show you. These are the original mounting holes for the old Kohler. So I don't want to drill any more holes in the frame than I have to. So what I can do, and I believe we're going to be okay, if I drill 4 new holes in this plate where my spacers will sit underneath, we can bolt the plate to the chassis and we'll have enough room to bolt the new engine to the plate. So kind of hard to explain, but just follow along, it'll make sense. Got my holes marked. We'll drill these 2 out first. Gets rid of the burrs. Well, let's see how we did. All right, not too bad. See, we still got a little bit of wiggle room too, which is what we want. So let's cut some spacers and get those mocked up and get those welded on. All right, guys, I lied to you. That engine plate isn't 1/8 inch, it's actually 3/16. Once I clean the slag off, I could actually measure it. So that being said, my spacer pucks need to be 1 1/16 inches. I hope that's right, but you know, we got a little bit of leeway. So we're gonna measure this out the best we can and see about cutting this. This little saw here is just a little cheap Drill Master brand from Harbor Freight. It's better than trying to use a hand grinder, but not by much. Just gives you a little bit more control. All right, guys, got these somewhat cleaned up. Let's mock them up, see what we got. All right, guys, all I'm trying to do now, make sure I get these pieces. I want them completely, you know, hidden underneath the plate. I don't want any of them sticking out anywhere. I think instead of trying to mark them and risk losing where they went, I'm just going to try to tack them in place where they're at, and then we'll get them on the bench and fully burn them in. All right, guys, I'm not gonna bother showing you my welds up close because trust me, they're awful. But those aren't really load bearing. They just need to not move. So I put some tacks on them. We will get this bolted down solid and then we'll repeat the process for the engine. Now none of this is permanent, guys. I'm just mocking this up whenever I know it's what we need. It's, I'm gonna end up painting it obviously before I fully commit to leaving it, you know what I mean? I'm not even going to use lock washers right now. When I bolt it down for good, it's going to get some nylocks. Well, this thing is lighter than that Kohler, but it's still not light. Now, if my math was correct, we should be at, look at that. You guys can see that. 6 inches on the money. Perfect. Well, guys, I'm gonna spend the next 5 or 10 minutes here just getting everything lined up, figuring out how I want to mount this pulley, how far over to scoot the engine. So I'll bring you guys back whenever I've got the holes drilled and I'm putting some bolts in it. So see you in a bit. Man, I cannot believe how productive I'm being today. Got it all bolted down. Again, this ain't permanent. All this stuff's gonna be getting nylocks. I'm gonna paint this engine plate and all that. But anyway, what do you guys think? I think it looks pretty straight to me. maybe kicked out a little bit. We can adjust that whenever we do the final mount. But I also got my keyway put in here. So that's good. I was kind of worried after taking all that material out, my keyway wouldn't be deep enough, but worked out good. Shaved that down just a little bit to give me some clearance, and it went right in. So we're gonna go ahead and get the crank pulley put in. I think the next thing we're gonna do is find some old diesel fuel and see if we can't get this thing to come to life. So I'll bring you guys back for that. I swear this styrofoam is everywhere. We're gonna pull this muffler apart and clean all that stuff out before we start this thing. Look at that. Huh, well, this engine's already been ran. Sure looks like it, don't it? Well, let me explain before you guys start making crazy wild accusations here. I managed to find a little bit of diesel underneath the shelf that's been sitting there for about 8 months, give or take. I did a fuel sump on one of my old Cummins. Anyway, had a bunch of junk in it, so I did the smart thing, got an auxiliary fuel tank with a filter, so I'm filtering that diesel fuel down into the actual diesel tank, and then hopefully we'll be able to start this thing. I reckon I should probably put some oil in this thing. Might last a little bit longer if I do. Let's see, that's good. It's starting to run back out. Oh yeah, it'll make a hell of a mess. That's nice. Well, I'm assuming this is like any other diesel. You need to bleed the fuel out of the, bleed the air out of the fuel system, but you know, the Chinese being so thoughtful, they put this top injector nut right in between the valve cover and this muffler. So I either need to take the muffler off to crack that open. I think for now we'll just start at the bottom. You guys just keep watching down here. All right, guys, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong or what. I pulled this muffler off, tried cracking that bleeder. I'm hardly getting a dribble out of it. I made sure fuel is getting from the tank to this unit pump. And so I know that that banjo bolt, I know it's working right. Fuel should be flowing to that. So yeah, I don't know, guys, something ain't right here. I know diesels can be a pain in the butt to bleed, but this one's pretty simple. So, well, guys, I sat down for a minute, had a cold snack, and did some thinking. And that's something you guys should always do whenever you get flustered with a project. Otherwise, you break stuff. So I'm sitting here thinking, the instructions from what I can translate, you're supposed to, this is the idle adjustment. So you're supposed to open her up wide open, crank that down, and that's your start position. Well, this is attached to a little spring. You follow that spring up, you guys can barely see it. There's a governor arm in there. That's actually what controls the throttle. Well, hang on, let me get a flashlight. You guys can see this. All right, let's try this again. This little brass colored arm in here, that's the throttle linkage arm. Well, this throttle, when I pull it, it stretches the spring, but this damn thing doesn't move. So I think that's my problem. The fuel is in off position and I cannot get this thing to move. So I'm gonna try to pry on a little bit. Maybe they put some silicone on here to stop an oil leak and it's seized up. I don't know. So I'm gonna poke and pry on this and see if we can't get this freed up. Well, guys, I poked and prodded and pried and pushed and bent and cussed and threw tools, and I could not get this governor arm to move. So I did find a guy, because literature on these things, I know it's out there, but I'm having a hard time finding parts diagrams and stuff. But I found a feller on YouTube. His name, I think the channel is Mossy Creek Vids or Mossy Oak Vids. And he's got a very detailed teardown series of one of these. And from what I can tell from his video, this governor is attached to an arm that runs down to the unit pump here. And that is supposed to move freely, and it slides that plunger in and out of that injector to control fuel flow. So either that rod has popped out or jammed up, or there's a washer stuck in there from the Chinese factory, or this pump itself is seized up. Something's going on. So I think the next thing I need to do, unfortunately, is dump all this oil back out that I just put in and pop this side cover off. I think that's going to make the most sense instead of trying to pull this injector, because I don't think you can pull this without pulling that first. I might be wrong, I don't know. So that's gonna be the next thing we get into. Yeah, this is going about as good as I thought it was gonna go. I need to remind myself to get an oil drain extension for this, because this is gonna be a problem. You guys can see that or not. But yeah, like I was saying, this is locked up tighter than a drum, and it's supposed to move freely. Let me get this cleaned up and get it situated so you guys can see what I'm doing here. Guys, at the bottom of this, it's got this nasty goop stuff. I don't know if that's old fuel, but I'm starting to wonder how long this thing actually sat in the warehouse. Let's take this off and we'll see if this injector's froze up, because if that's the kind of stuff that's sitting in that injector, that might be why it's not moving. I mean, it is just downright sticky. I don't know what it is. If you guys can see that, there's a little plunger back in there that this fork goes against. Oh yeah, that's locked up tighter than a drum. As this pivots against that governor, it's on that shaft down in there. It's supposed to walk it out that way towards the camera, and it's not moving. Well, I guess we're in this far. Let's go ahead and take the injector out. They did machine a little groove in there so you can get this out. That's what we got. But guys, I just spent the last 10 minutes going at this thing with some WD-40, just working it. You can see how easy that moves now, and this plunger was actually stuck. I'm assuming that'd be all the way, well, if it pushes all the way open, closed, I don't know. But now you can see it's moving freely. The throttle or the fuel control is working properly. I think everything's moving freely. I don't know. I just think this thing has sat for a long time with some crappy diesel fuel in it, and it just gummed this thing up solid. I don't know, it's working good now, I think. I guess we'll see if we can't get it put back together and try to start it again. Ah, success. Okay. All right, guys, I think the torque spec on this is about 2 ugga-duggas. All right, guys, side cover's back on, fuel line's hooked back up. I'm leaving this one off for now. I'm gonna pull the engine over a few times and just make sure that I get all that WD-40 flushed out, and hopefully it's fixed. So we should know pretty quick. There should be quite a bit of fuel that starts coming out of that open injector. So let's see what happens. Oh, I did get oil put back in it too. I didn't want to bore you guys with watching me do it again. Oh, we got some coming. All right. Oh yeah, we've already got fuel. All right, guys, are you finally ready to see if this thing will run? Trying a few more times for good measure. Hear that injector opening and closing now. Well, that's a start. Let's try again. Hell yeah. Man, has this thing been a struggle. I'm so glad to hear that thing run. Well, it is the next day, guys. Just came out here a little bit ago, and boy, did I make a mess last night. You guys know how that goes. Something ain't working right, you just put your head down, throw tools everywhere. So I spent some time cleaning that mess up, and I've got this thing somewhat rigged up to where we should be able to test drive it. So I had to do some shady work on the throttle linkage, but none of this is permanent. All this is gonna come back off, and don't forget, we've got an electric start to put on this, and that actually changes your throttle cable bracketry anyway. So I got the belt put on, got the rear fenders put on just so I got somewhere to sit. Got a nice car floor mat to protect my ass from this stuff underneath. I don't know, let's fire it up and I don't know, take it for a cruise. Pulled the wrong lever. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'd call that test drive a success. This thing is just, I don't know, only ever messing with the Predator engines and these Kohlers and gas engines. I mean, I've had diesel pickup trucks and I run equipment for a living, but there's just something weird about this thing when you're riding it. I don't know. It's cool. I'm happy with it. I did notice that we kept kicking the drive belt off. Kind of figured it's pretty worn down. I'm sure it's stretched. So I do trying to get a new one. I found one, gonna get that ordered. So yeah, as far as the first test drive, I think that went pretty smooth. Well guys, that is gonna do it for this episode on Laid Off Garage. We got the engine all mounted up, we got the belt drive put on it, and we took it for its first test drive. And for the most part, it was a success. Drive belt kept coming off, but that's nothing to worry about. So I've got a whole bench full of parts waiting to go on this thing. So make sure you guys subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date on what I got going on. So as always, guys, I appreciate you watching, you guys commenting, and thanks for following along. I'll see you guys on the next one.